Hi, it's Rob from Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint Brutogg Corpse-Eater from Curse City. If you'd like to support the channel, our Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below. Now on to the video. So the first colour we're using is Citadel Baneblade Brown. I'm going to use this to do some of the leather on the miniature. So we're going to start by doing the leather tunic-y kind of bit that he's got the armour plates attached to here. Just covering his upper legs and his waist. So I'm only going to be a bit of a crisscross of the Baneblade Brown here. I'm also going to use it on the leather kind of satchel that he's got on his back there. Next up, Citadel Leadbelcher. I'm going to use this to paint the head of the mace, also the blade, each of these little metal patches on the tunic, and also you've got the helmet, the chainmail, and the other little bits of metal that you can see poking out there. That's a little bit of Citadel Mephiston Red. So painting the inside of his mouth. On this part you'll see me painting the shoulder pad and also the little bottle that's hanging from his neck. Now if you are painting this, I'd recommend doing this in Balthazar Gold first instead, because I'm going to use Balthazar Gold and then Blood Angel's Red contrast, which will give that the metallic red kind of look that it's got in the pictures. So I'll paint that with Balthazar Gold a little later on. Next up we're going to use some Citadel Calgar Blue. I'm going to use this to do his trousers. When you paint his trousers, just be aware there's some leather straps which he's got going around the top of his boots and the bottom of his trousers. Just keep your eyes peeled when you're painting these on. Now I'm going to use Citadel Balor Brown. I'm going to use this to do all of the fur bits which are poking out from the underside of the tunic. Call it a tunic, not really sure what you call it, but all these little fur bits we're going to be painting with this anyway. I'm going to use some Vallejo Black. I'm going to use this to paint his boots, make sure that they're one smooth flat colour. Been sprayed with Halford's matte black paint to begin with. So make sure that his gloves on that left hand, I've got that glove painted on black too. I'm going to use some Citadel Balthazar Gold. As I say, I do the edging with Balthazar Gold in this part, but I actually repaint the whole shoulder pad other than the gold trim. So if you paint where you've painted red, paint that with Balthazar Gold, or where I've painted red, paint it with Balthazar Gold, I should say. Because we're going to use a different effect for that, which will give us more of a nice metallic finish for it. Now Citadel Retributor Armour, I'm going to use this to do some of the patterns on the shoulder pad. You've also got certain sections on the blades which are on his belt, hanging down his back there. Also going to do a thin band of this on the helmet as well, the thin band which is running horizontally on each side. several of the large buckles. Now going to paint his skin, we're going to use Citadel Cadian Fleshtone. So you have his face, his hands, both arms. Plenty of details on the face and the neck. Those hands too. I'll be trying to paint on some of the muscle details too. I'm going to use a little bit of Tallarn sand, and it's just going to be to do the rope which is holding on his two pendants. Give this a nice smooth coat of Tallarn sand. I'm going to use Citadel Rakarth flesh. I'm going to use this to paint the bone horn which is growing from the forehead of his pauldron. I'll also use this to do his teeth if you want to. We'll be recolouring his teeth a little bit later, but if you want to paint the inside of the mouth first and then do these teeth later on, that's fine too. A bit of Citadel Dawnstone now. I'm going to use this to paint the flask which is hanging from his hip. There's also a little runestone on the other side of the swords from where we are. You can see now that that satchel next to it has been painted with the Baneblade brown too. And Rhinox hide is going to be used to do all the straps and the belts. There's quite a lot. He's got them wrapped around his hands. There's also one from the handle of the mace going around his wrist. Got straps on the other arm as well, going all the way from the wrist to the shoulder. Straps around the tops of his boots or the bottom of his kecks. Obviously his belt, the one going around his chest, and some little bits on his back and around the weapons too. I'm going to paint the ones on the weapons with Mournfang brown now, just to keep them a little bit different. This is where we're up to so far. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Dryad Bark. We're going to use this to paint the handle of the mace. Clean off a little bit of sprue that was still attached there. Next up is Citadel Khorne Red. I'm going to use this to paint the scabbard on the larger of the two blades. Like so. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Mournfang brown. Use this to do the pouch, the coin purse on his left there, and also some of the little straps that are going across the scabbard as well, just to break them up from the Rhinox hide used on all the other straps. Now I'm going to start shading it. I'm going to start with Citadel Contrast Snakebite Leather. I'm going to use this to go over all of the Baneblade brown. Now once this layer is actually dry, I didn't put quite enough on there, so it didn't give it that leathery look that I was going for. So I gave it another coat of Snakebite Leather once it had dried, just to get that the finish that I wanted. But basically you want to be using this on any of the Baneblade brown that you've applied to the miniature. It's a great contrast, that I really like that contrast. Next up, Citadel Nolan Oil. I'm going to use this on all of the Rhinox hide and all of the Leadbelcher, so you've got plenty to do with this one. Now we're going to use some Citadel Drakenhof Nightshade, and this is just going to be a quick one to colour in that Calgar blue on his keks. Like so. Follow that with some Citadel Reichland Flesh Shade. Just going to do all of his skin with this. There's a lot of detail on his skin, so it is quite cool to paint up. Take your time with that, use a really thin brush. You can pick out some really great details with his face. I'm going to use Citadel Agrax Shade. I'm going to use this to do the fur and also any of the gold parts. On that shoulder pad, as I say, if you've painted that Balthazar Gold, a little bit later we'll be using the Blood Angels Red contrast to paint over that. Be doing the same with that jar which is hanging around his neck too, with a little bottle. Also use this Agrax shade on the rope too. I'm going to use Citadel Druchii Violet. So if you ignore the shoulder pad and the bottle, you're mainly going to use this on his mouth, because we are going to repaint that shoulder pad. The reason I repainted it was I came to paint it a few days ago and realised that I wasn't quite happy with how I was going to be trying to get it to look metallic afterwards, so I thought I'd restart that and get it looking metallic from the get-go. I'm going to use some Citadel Seraphim Sepia, this just to use on his teeth and also that spike which is coming out of the shoulder pad. Citadel Contrast Gore Grunter Fur. I'm going to use this on the leather pouch and also the leather straps where we used Mournfang brown. Like so. Okay, so now starting with the Balthazar Gold, we're going to redo that shoulder pad. You can see from the white background this has been done since I've changed how I film the videos. The initial parts were recorded back when Cursed City first came out. This has been recorded a bit more recently. So just give all that section where you put that Mephiston Red, give that a nice coat of Balthazar Gold, and also give the bottle hanging around his neck some Balthazar Gold too. Then we're going to wash them both with Citadel Contrast Blood Angels Red. What that'll do is give that nice orangey kind of red, shading it in the recesses and highlighting the raised areas, but still letting you see that metallic through it, so you still get the metallic effect even though there's the red on top of it. So that gives you a nice base for what we're going to try and do with that shoulder pad. Next up, Citadel Cadian Fleshtone. We're going to start working on his skin. So using a small layer brush to start off with, we're just going to start picking out the details and reapplying the colour, making sure to leave the raglan flesh shade in all the recesses and try and pick out all those bumps and details because there is a lot on the face. Now we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo White to the Cadian Fleshtone and just start to highlight this using the Army Painter Wargamer character brush, which is smaller than the small layer brush. We're just going to start highlighting the skin that we've applied already. When you get down to the arms and the muscles, start putting the striations on the muscles with this layer. So we're going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix. Start highlighting once again. You can just about make the striations out on that arm in the background there. But mainly doing the face to show you how I'm doing the face here. If you want to put any muscle striations on them, if you have a look at the pictures of anatomy diagrams and stuff like that where you have the muscle groups and it shows you which way the lines go, you can do that quite easy. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Rakarth flesh here. I'm going to just apply this to his teeth. Pick each of those out. Be very, very careful not to join them together. If you do, just get a little bit of the Seraphim Sepia and place that in between them again, just to get that little gap in there. Now we're going to use a little bit of white and mix that with the Rakarth flesh, just so you can highlight those teeth. Like so. I'm going to use some Citadel Cassandora Yellow Shade. We're just going to go along the bottom of each of the teeth just to yellow them up a little bit. If you get a bit too much on, just clean your brush off quickly and then absorb a little bit of that shade back. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Pink Horror. Just going to gently poke through between those teeth and highlight his tongue in his mouth there. Like so. I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo White just to do his eyes. So you're going to be turning the miniature so that you're dragging the brush away from the nose towards the outside of the face to get that smooth white line for the eye there. Like so. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo Black to put a little spot in for each eye. I'm going to try and get these nice and small. Do that fine on the first eye, but typically do the second eye, get a nice big spot in there, and then I'm going to use a little bit of white to touch that up and get it so it's the same size as the other side. Here, just slightly off camera, I'm just putting that so it's sideways so I can drag the brush away from the centre of the nose again, but this time I'm just dragging it away from the part of the pupil so that it's the same size as the one on the other side. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Agraxair shade. We're just going to give the ball of the mace a coat of this, and this is to dull it down a little bit more. You can see quite a lot of the detail I've put onto the skin there. I'm also going to use the Agraxair shade just to add a little bit of grime to the armour plates, the helmet, the blade, on his fist there, and little armour plates and things like that, and little patches on his chainmail. Now I'm going to move on to the gold sections using Citadel Retributor armour. I'm just going to reapply the gold, leaving the Agraxair shade in the recesses and in the areas that wouldn't be catching the light. Now we're going to use Citadel Liberator Gold, and we're going to start highlighting the sections of gold that we just painted on. So here you want to be thinking about where the light is going to be catching it, applying the Liberator Gold to those areas. Now we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo Modeler Chrome to the Liberator Gold. We're just going to do some final little spot highlights and edge highlights to the golden areas, just to make them stand out. The extra pigment in the Liberator Gold and Chrome mix, it being lighter from the Chrome, will make these edges stand out loads. It does give a really nice shine without too much effort. I'm going to use some Citadel Leadbelcher. I'm going to start picking out some of the details on the helm, on the armour plates. We don't want to go all over it and make it all shiny again. I do want to have it quite dull, with slight areas where it's either been brushed or slightly polished, not as tarnished as the rest. So it's got these little shiny sections in it, and you can highlight around those dents and make them stand out a little bit more too. I'm going to do some final little highlights on the Leadbelcher areas using some Vallejo Modeler Chrome. We're just going to use this to go around the edges of those little square panels of armour, pick out the details on the helm and on the knee pad, and also on the mace and the blade on his hand too. So now I'm going to use Citadel Balor Brown. I'm going to start reapplying the colour to the fur on the top of the boots and underneath that armoured tunic. So you're going to be leaving the shade in the recesses there, just trying to get the raised areas of the fur with the Balor Brown. Leave a little bit of the shade at the top of each strand of fur as well, not just give it a little look of shade where it goes underneath. Just do that for all of the pieces of fur. Once you finish that, we're going to add some Vallejo White to the Balor Brown, and we're just going to highlight maybe the bottom third of each section, or the bottom half of each section. That will just bring a nice little highlight to those strands of fur, make them stand out a little. So now we're going to use some Citadel Rakarth flesh. And we're just going to use this to do some very, very light scuffs on the bottom edge and the vertical edges of the leather strip that you can see underneath these metal plates. And this is just as though it has been scuffed, so that you've still got that nice brown leather colour from the snakebite leather and the Baneblade brown. And the Rakarth flesh is just giving that light scuffed leather colour just on the very edge of that. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo White and mix that with the Rakarth flesh, and we're just going to do one final light scuffing effect along the bottom, just adding a little bit of a lighter colour so there's some deeper scuffs on there. Just along that edge, so you're doing vertical strokes on the horizontal edge and horizontal strokes on the vertical edge, just to give that rough look, so it's been caught and scuffed and stuff whilst fighting. Now I'm going to go back to the pants, so we're using Citadel Calgar Blue. You're just going to reapply this to the trousers that you can see between the sections of fur. In the case of his right leg there, you've got the strap from that knee pad. So you want to make sure that you leave the shade in the recesses, and also the shade in any areas there being overhung by some of the material above. Now because this is material, you don't have to be 100% smooth with this. The material would have obviously the texture on it and scuffs itself. I'm now going to add some white to the Calgar Blue and just start highlighting this. So you don't have to do it 100% smooth, it doesn't have to be perfectly smooth highlights or anything like that. You want that kind of almost rough looking highlights like you would do on those leather bits where you scuffed it in the previous parts. I'm going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix. I'm going to highlight the trousers once more, just a final little edge highlight to give that a bit more of a rough look. One final little highlight on the areas that be catching more light. Now we're going to work on the boots, so we're going with Vallejo Black. We're just going to paint over the boots so we can cover any colours which may have got on them or any little scuffs. He's quite a large model, he can be quite close to the edge, so you can rub some of the paint off his feet with your thumb as you're rotating it. It's one good thing these paint handles are for, is just keeping your hands away from the miniatures so you don't rub any little bits of paint off them while you're going. So just give them a nice coat of black again, then we can start on the highlights. So the first highlight, we're going to use some Vallejo German Grey. You're just going to highlight all the raised areas and the areas that be catching the light. Also use this for doing that glove on his left hand too. He's got a fingerless glove just under that metal thing. Once you've done that, use some Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey. We're just going to do some little edge highlights on the boots, just catch those edges, just to make them stand out so you've got the details and the shape of the boot quite visible there. Like so. Now we're going to use Citadel Rhinox hide. We're going to start working on all the straps and the belts now. So you're going to reapply the Rhinox hide, leaving the Nuln Oil in the recesses. So most of the belts and straps have a almost concave look to them, so that they are going to be darker in the middle and lighter on the top and the bottom. Some of them do have a bit of a convex to them, so that you are going to have the lighter part in the middle though. I think that's mainly the straps that are wrapped around his arm behind that metal spike glove thing. Then going to add a little bit of Rakarth flesh to the Rhinox hide. We're going to start highlighting these like we did with the leather part on the tunic. You're going to be doing vertical strokes on the horizontal edges, horizontal strokes on the vertical edges, and you're just going to paint this up as though it's scuffed leather. If he's fighting, he's wearing chainmail, he's carrying all kinds of stuff on his belts and that, it would be quite scuffed, because it's going to be rubbing against all those things. Possibly getting hit by some of the undead in the Cursed City and what have you too. And for the final highlight on this, we're going to add a little bit more Rakarth flesh. We're just going to do one final highlight, much like you did on the previous section. But you're going to do smaller highlights just to add some lighter coloured scuffs into those bits. Next we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo red wash. All we're going to use this for is for his bottom lip, to give that a bit of a pinkish colour. Might have to give it one or two little coats, but that'll come nice and pink there, and it'll also have the highlights that you've previously put on showing through. I'm going to use Citadel Leadbelcher. I'm going to use this to paint on the studs on those bands which are strapped around his arm. Like so. I'm going to use some Citadel Khorne Red. I'm going to work on the scabbard, so that blade on the back there. So when you be applying this, you want to think about where light will be catching it, and only highlighting the areas that be getting a lot of light. So that little bit on the underside there, you want to leave the shade underneath where the other sword is hanging over, and then you want to be doing most of the highlights on the top edge, where it curls around towards his right leg. I'm going to go on to Citadel Wazdakka Red, just add the first highlight, so you want to be covering about half of the area that you just covered with the Khorne Red with this one. And the final highlight, we're going to use some Citadel Pink Horror, and just do a little tiny bit of highlight on the top edge there, and maybe a little bit on the underside too. Like so. So now I'm going to work on that pot that's on his hip. I'm going to use Mechanicus Standard Grey initially on this. When I'm redoing this, I'm leaving almost like a V shape of a shade. I'm going to be working on painting on like a little crack on the side of that. So you can see where I've left the shade in almost like a V shape, and then a little V on each side too, just where the crack's kind of fractured. I'm just going to paint some of that onto the runestone hanging from the blade too. We're going to move on to Citadel Dawnstone. I'm going to start highlighting the jar or the bottle as you would normally with the areas catching the light, but you want to make sure that you get a nice coat of that underneath the crack so that the crack is a bit more highlighted. You can see that's starting to stand out now where I'm putting on the Dawnstone. You want to highlight all those surfaces on it where you've got the edge that would be catching a light on the top, and that sort of like ridge just by the base of the handle too. Now I'm going to use Citadel Administratum Grey. I think it's the first time I've ever used this colour. I just found it in the drawer the other day, so I thought why not. You're just going to highlight the underside of each of the cracks. You do really want to be highlighting only one side of the crack, and that's the side that's going to be catching the light. You can add a few little spots on the top edge of it, but you mainly want those highlights to be on the bottom edge, and that will make those stand out and look like there is a bit of a crack running down that part. So before we start this part, I'm just going to show you here where we redid that shoulder pad. I've redone the bottle in the same thing, so that's Balthazar Gold and then washed with Blood Angels Red contrast. We're now going to use some Citadel Tallarn sand just to go up the rope and paint each of those individual strands with this so that you've got the shade in the recesses. That brings back the colour of the rope. And try and get each of these sections painted nicely so that you can see it distinctly from the recesses, but if you do fill any of the recesses with a bit of paint, you can just go over that with the shade as well and paint the shade on in a similar way to you're doing here. That should sort that out for you. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Balthazar Gold. I'm going to work on the little jar around his neck and also the shoulder pad. So all I'm doing here is picking out the area details and kind of dry brushing it on so that it picks out those raised areas. I have turned up the contrast really high here just so that you can, or turned up the exposure really high just so you can see that a little bit easier because it wasn't showing up too well. So here we've mixed a little tiny bit of Citadel Retributor Armour with the Balthazar Gold, and we are just lightly dry brushing this over the top again just to pick out those details and those raised areas so you get them showing in a nice metallic tone on that shoulder pad and also on the bottle around his neck. Now we're using a little bit of Ironbreaker mixed with the previous mix just to do another highlight on these bits. The reason I'm doing an extra little highlight here is I wanted the silvery metallic as the top highlight, but didn't want it to contrast too much against the Retributor Armour and Balthazar Gold mix. So doing a quick one with a tiny little bit of Ironbreaker in there to lighten it up, and then finally doing one little dry brush layer of Ironbreaker just to pick out those details and make that final highlight nice and light. Like so. Now I'm going to work on that horn coming out the top of the shoulder pad. I'm going to use Citadel Rakarth Flesh to paint the initial layer. I'm going to be painting this in almost vertical lines going down on the spike so that you get those lines within the bone. Now I'm going to mix in a little bit of Ushabti bone for the first highlight. Like so. Now we're going to add a little bit of white to the previous mix and we're just going to do one final highlight on that spine, that spike. We'll be doing it the same way with the lines running down the sides, but you only want to be covering a tiny area with this, so it's mainly a very light tip to it with a few little lines running down. Also using that to paint the skull on his base too. Final highlight on that. Now we're going to use some Citadel Moot Green and we're going to do the gemstone on his pendant there. So we did all the gold as we were working through, and we're now just doing that little gem in the middle. So give that a nice smooth layer of Citadel Moot Green. Then once you've finished that, you're going to give it a wash with Citadel Biel-Tan Green Shade, which is this layer here. And then while that's drying, we're going to work on another part of the miniature and then come back to this gemstone to do all the highlights. So just give that a nice coat of Biel-Tan Green so it darkens that down, and we can move on. Now we're going to use some Dryad Bark. This is going to be to do the handle of his mace. So we're going to be painting this lengthways. There is some grain on that wood, some little notches and little areas of detail on it, so you just want to try and pick those out and leave the shade in the recesses. Now we're going to add some Citadel Rakarth Flesh to the Dryad Bark, and we're just going to highlight those areas. just pick them out. Like so. Going to add a little bit more Rakarth flesh to the previous mix. I'm just going to do some really nice thin highlights on some of those lengthways sections, and also on one side of each of the notches where it'd be catching the light. So returning to the gemstone, we are now going to use Citadel Moot Green. I'm going to kind of paint almost like a crescent that covers maybe half of the gemstone on the left hand side and across the bottom of it, so you're leaving that Biel-Tan green shaded area on the top and the top right. We're going to mix some white with the Moot Green. I'm going to cover about 50% of the area we did with the previous highlight. Like so. We're now going to mix a little bit more white with the previous mix. And we're going to try and cover about 50% of the previous highlight again, just so that we can get another little lighter part there. You'll see that you're starting to get that nice light crescent on the bottom left. Finally, we're going to use some pure Vallejo White to do a spot on the top right of the gemstone, and then a tiny thin line on the bottom left. That is the gemstone finished. Now we're going to use some Vallejo Model Air Chrome. I'm going to use this to paint the little rune on the front of that jar that he's got hanging from his neck. There's also one on the back too. Just be careful when you're doing this, because it's very easy to get the Model Air Chrome onto another area of that vial. If you're very careful, you'll be alright. Now I'm going to use Citadel Mournfang Brown. I'm going to reapply some colour to that pouch on the back there. We've also got some of the straps around the two blades on his back. You can highlight too. Now we're going to add some Rakarth flesh to the Mournfang Brown, and much like we did on the leather straps, we're going to paint on some scuffs onto these straps here, and also onto that coin pouch that he's got on his belt. And finally we're going to add a little bit more Rakarth flesh to the previous mix, and do a final layer of highlights to these bands of leather that are strapped, holding those swords on, and also onto the coin pouch to give some wear and tear to that, so it's not completely smooth. So you can do these quite rough and ready, just to give that look as though it's been scuffed and well used. And that is the finished Brutogg Corpse-Eater. Really pleased with how he came out. There's loads of fantastic details on there. Really was good miniature to paint. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much. If you like the channel and you enjoy the content and you'd like to support us, our Coffee and Patreon pages are linked below. Thanks very much.